Hello and welcome back to the second portion of lesson 1.2. Today we're going to look at evaluating algebraic expressions. Now the one thing you have to remember is whenever you see the word evaluate, essentially that means that we're going to be substituting a given number for each variable in the equation, and then we're going to solve. So evaluate ultimately means we are going to solve. So example 4 says to evaluate each expression for r equals 9 and t equals 14. With part A, I know if r is going to be 9, this gives me 9, and we said t is going to be 14, and because I have this right here, I really know that my t is going to be squared. I'm going to go through and do my order of operations first. So order of operations tells me I need to do my exponents. So I really have 9 times 14 squared, which is 196. So if I multiply 9 and 196, I get 1,764. Now if we go to part B, I have my r value as being squared, so we know that r is 9. So I square that. I multiply that by t, which in this case is 14. So here I have 81 times 14. And when I do that math, I end up with 1,134. Now for my final part, which is part C, I see that my r and my t are inside of parentheses being multiplied. So I have 9 times 14, and then I'm going to take that answer and I'm going to square it. So 9 times 14 is going to give me 126, and then I square that, and when I square that, I end up with 15,876. Now for example 5, we are given a formula for volume. It says BH divided by 3, or base times height divided by 3. And then I'm told that B is 4 square centimeters and H is 6 square centimeters. So when I solve for my volume, I'm going to plug in 4, and because I have units, I'm going to keep my units. So I have 4 centimeters squared times my height, which is 6 centimeters. Oh, not squared, it's just 6 centimeters. And I'm going to divide this by 3. So now, when I multiply 4 times 6, I end up with 24. And centimeters squared times another centimeter is actually going to give me centimeters cubed. And then I'm going to divide that by 3. When I go to simplify this, 24 divided by 3 is actually 8, and my units of cubic centimeters will carry through to the end, and that right there is my final volume. Now you want to keep your units with your numbers, and I cannot stress that enough, okay? Especially when you go to get into your science classes and stuff, units are incredibly important, okay? And sometimes if you've done something incorrectly in your problem, your units will tell you that. So because I'm dealing with volume and cubic centimeters is a volume, I at least know that I'm probably on the right track because my units worked out to be correct. For example 6, I'm going to apologize. It looks like when I imported the PowerPoint, something happened. So we have actually part C here, part D here, and then I'm just going to come over here and draw a line. This right here is actually another part C, and then this here is at the end, this is just a part D. So we'll work with what we have here. So for the first part C, it says that we have a negative 0.3, and we're going to square that. Now remember, the squaring function really means that this is a negative 0.3 times another negative 0.3. Okay, so two negatives, when they multiply by each other, are going to cancel and become a positive, and 0.3 times 0.3 is going to give me a positive 0.09. Likewise, when I come over here to this part D, I have a negative outside, so that's really like saying negative 1 times 3/4 squared. Okay, order of operations tells me I have to do the squaring stuff first. And if you recall, I have to square both the numerator and the denominator. So this really becomes a negative 1 times 3 squared divided by 4 squared. And I'm just going to slide this up a little bit. And when I simplify this, I end up with a negative 1 times 3 squared will give me 9. 4 squared gives me 16. So I end up with a negative 1 times 9/16, or a negative 9/16. And then finally for part D is similar. Oh, sorry, I have the part C that's kind of half hidden. And actually looking at this now, like I said, I don't know what happened when I brought this over. These here are actually the exact same thing that we just did. So we are going to scratch those and ignore those for now. Example 7 says to evaluate each expression. Here we are given that t is equal to negative 2 and r is equal to negative 7. Now when you're given negative values to plug in, I like to use parentheses myself. So for part A, we have r, which is negative 7. So I have negative 7, and I'm going to subtract. And then for t, I'm going to plug in a negative 2. So if you remember from last year, okay, I have this double negative. So if I change this to a positive and this to a positive, I really have negative 7 plus a positive 2. Because my signs are different, that's really like saying 7 minus 2. So I know 7 minus 2 is 5, and because the 7 is the bigger of the two numbers and it has a negative, I know that my answer is really going to be a negative 5. Now for part B, I have t minus r. So this is going to give me a negative 2 minus a negative 7. So again, I'm going to plug in that parenthesis and do a negative 7 there. I have a negative minus a negative, which is going to change these both to positive. So if I rewrite this, I have negative 2 plus 7. And again, when I look at my signs, they're different. I have a positive and a negative, so I'm going to just subtract the 2 and the 7, which will give me 5. But because the 7 is the bigger of the two numbers, and that's positive, I know that my answer will be 5. Now with part C says that we have a negative t, or in other words, we have a negative 2 minus r, which is a negative 7. And when I look at this here, I have a double negative, which will change positive, and I have a double negative here. So this really gives me 2 plus 7, or I get an answer of 9. And then for part D I'm going to just do down here. So I really have negative r, or negative 7. And again, this is part D down here. And then I'm going to subtract a negative, and that's a negative t inside the parentheses, so that's a negative 2. Okay, now when I look at this is a little bit tricky, but we can do it. So I have a negative 7, which makes that positive. And then inside of my parentheses, I have a negative, negative. So those become positive. So to simplify this, I really have a positive 7 minus a positive 2, which looks something like this. And now 7 minus 2, I see, is really 5. So with this example, you can see that you have to be careful with your negatives, especially when you're substituting to evaluate an expression. For example 8, here I notice in part A, I have a negative 1 on the outside, and I'm going to multiply that by C, which is a negative 8, times my D value, which is a negative 7. So inside of my parentheses, I end up with a positive product because a negative times a negative is a positive. So this is going to give me a negative 1 times 8 times 7 is 56. And negative 1 times 56 is a negative 56. So this is my final answer. For part B, I have negative 2 times negative 3 times CD. Well, C is a negative 8 times a negative 7. So again, when I go and I do my products, 2 times 3 is 6. A negative times a negative is a positive. So I end up with 6. And negative 8 times a negative 7 is a positive 56. So 6 times 56 is 336. And finally, for part C, I have a value of C, which is negative 8, times a negative, and D is negative 7. So when we simplify this, I have a negative 8. Well, actually, let's start inside of this parentheses here. So I have a negative, negative, which that's going to become a positive when I multiply those. So I really have a negative 8 times a positive 7. So I know that my overall answer will be negative, and 8 times 7 is 56. And for our last example, we are going to evaluate again, and we're going to start out by plugging in our numbers. So for part A, I have 3 times x, which is 8, divided by 2 times z, which is a negative 3. Then we're going to go plus y, which is a negative 5, and we're going to divide that by 10. So let's simplify our parentheses first. So this is going to give me 3 times 8, or 24. And we're going to divide that by 2 times a negative 3, which is negative 6. Then we're going to add that to a negative 5 divided by 10. So I have to do order of operations. So 24 divided by a negative 6 will give me a negative 4. Then I'm going to add that to negative 5 divided by 10. So I'm going to add that to a negative. That's going to give me a negative 1/2. And I have negative 4 plus a negative 1/2 will give me a negative 4 1/2. And I know that because when I add, if both of them have the same sign, I know that the final answer will have the same sign. So my final answer is a negative 4 1/2. For part B, we'll do part B over here. Part B says I have 2 times z, which is a negative 3, plus x, which is 8. And we're going to divide that whole thing by 2 times y, which is a negative 5. So if we simplify, we end up with negative 6 plus 8 divided by a negative 10. And negative 6 plus 8 is a positive 2 divided by a negative 10. So a positive divided by negative will give me a negative, and 2/10 will reduce down to 1/5. So I end up with a negative 1/5. Now for our last example, we'll do part C down here at the bottom. So part C says that we have 3 times z squared, and z, oops, if we can move this back, z was -3, and we are squaring that, minus 4 times y, which is a -5, and then we are going to divide that by x, which is 8. So now we need to simplify. So a -3 squared is 9, so I really have 3 times 9 minus 4 times a -5, and this will give me a positive 20 because I have a negative right here and a negative right here, so that's going to give me a positive 20.